What is going on, Chess YouTube? In today's video, we are looking at round number 5 of the ongoing World Chess Championship match between Ding Liren of China, the defending world champion, and Gukesh D of India, the challenger. And here we go. In the game, Gukesh D is playing as white. He opens 1e4, best by test, and of course, Gukesh as white. He is going to be playing for a win at all costs here, or at least that is my assumption. Now, Ding Liren. When Gukesh played 1e4 his first time as white, he did go 1e6, the French defense. That was a very big surprise, but of course he is normally a 1e5 player, and he is a specialist in the martial attack against the Ruy Lopez. So what does he want to play here? Well, it turns out he does go for the French defense once again with the move 1e6, and this move, when I saw it, absolutely shocked me. I mean, I thought he would be doing 1e5 for sure. I assumed e6 was a one-off surprise weapon, but no, that appears to be his main preparation for this match as black against 1e4. Very, very interesting. Now, Gukesh, of course, goes d4 and then d5. And now, Gukesh, how does he want to proceed? Well, his first game as white, when he went 1e4, he did go knight to c3 against the French defense. That, of course, is the absolute main line as white. However, instead, in this game, he does play the exchange variation. E takes d5, then e takes on the board. Now, this line is thought to be a lot more quiet. It's less aggressive. You do have the symmetrical pawn structure, and of course the e-file is opened up. And surprisingly, a lot of players did play this very line in the 2024 Candidates Tournament, so this appears to be a trendy thing at the highest level right now, but overall I was a little bit disappointed to see this. I thought Gukesh would go for a much more aggressive line, but no, I guess he's playing it safe so far, so let's see what he has in mind. Now, knight f3, then knight f6. Now, bishop d3 for white. This is the main line so far. White's plan may include castles, rook to e1, then bishop f4 or bishop g5, h3, and so on. That's kind of the main way to play as white. Now, here, Ding Liren. The main line for black, arguably, is just bishop d6, mirroring white's play. d6 is the best square for the bishop, then you castle, and very importantly, that bishop is controlling f4, stopping bishop f4 ideas. Now, here, instead of bishop d6, Ding Liren plays a very interesting move. That is the move c5, gaining space on the queen side immediately and putting pressure on that pawn on d4. Now, very often these lines do lead to isolated queen's pawn scenarios. For example, let's say white takes on c5, then black takes back. Black will then have that isolated pawn on d5, and that could be a weakness or a strength depending on how the game progresses. Now, it could be a weakness as that pawn is isolated. It has no other pawns on the c-file or the e-file next to it, and that makes it very hard to defend. Now, on the other hand, black will have a lot of open lines to attack with. For example, black could go, say, bishop d6, bishop c7, queen d6, putting pressure on h2, bishop g4, and so on, having a very aggressive position. So, c5, a very double-edged decision here by Ding Liren. Now, how does Gukesh want to proceed? In the game, he does go c3, just bolstering that pawn. Now, very importantly, most white players will not take on c5 yet. If you go on c5, then black can recapture in one go, bishop takes c5. The point of delaying d takes c5 is, let's say black goes, say, bishop d6 here. Then you can take on c5, and the bishop does waste one single tempo here. It goes to d6, then c5, recapturing, wasting a tempo. That means white would have to move c3 in for free, and overall, that would be good for white. Now, Ding Liren, of course, he can just trade on d4. For example, c takes d4, but then white is in no obligation to recapture with the pawn. He can just go knight takes d4 again, maintaining that very weak, isolated pawn on d5, and the knight would be perfectly placed on d4. Then white could go, say, knight 1 to d2, knight d to f3, and so on, and he would have a very harmonious setup. Now here, instead of those options, Ding Liren does go c4, gaining space on the queen side. And again, so far, Ding Liren is the one playing a little more actively, a little more ambitiously. He's honestly kind of the aggressor here, and Gukesh is playing a little bit passive. Now here we have bishop c2, and this pawn structure with the pawns on d5 and c4, it's actually seen very often in the Queen's Gambit opening. Black often goes for this, for example, in the London system, and it is very double-edged. Now, black does have a space advantage on the queen side. That means his main idea may be going for a queen side expansion with the moves b5, a5, then b4, trying to create something on the queen side. Now, on the other hand, white does have the very good e5 square for his knight, and he may be playing in the center and on the king side. All right, now, Gukesh in this position, Ding Liren in this position, it is his turn to move. Bishop d6 is the move, intending short castles. Now, Gukesh, instead of castling, that is what I expected. That is perhaps the most ambitious move, trying to keep all the pieces on the board. Instead of that, he does go queen to e2 here, giving the king a check. Now, this is the top engine line, but overall, again, I was a little bit disappointed by Gukesh here playing this move. The problem with this move is black can just go queen to e7, and then you are virtually forced to trade the queens off the board right away. That is what happens. Queen takes and then king takes. And yes, the king is a little bit misplaced on e7, but overall black is going to be just fine. For example, you can go say rook e8, then king to f8, artificially castling the king, and you're going to have virtually zero problems here as black. I mean, the engine does say white has a tiny microscopic advantage, but overall, Ding Liren, he's doing just fine out of the opening. Now here, Gukesh, short castles, then rook e8, rook e1, king f8, and then the rooks do come off the board. Rook takes and king takes. And again, so far, Gukesh, he does have a very, very small advantage. Maybe he can make something out of it. It's very similar to the last game where Ding Liren played that very offbeat opening with knight f3, b3, bishop a3, and so on, where he got a little microscopic advantage, but it wasn't much. And overall, Ding Liren, again, should be okay if he plays precisely. Now, Gukesh, he does find the best follow-up here. Bishop g5, putting immediate pressure on that knight, and now the threat is just bishop takes f6, trying to damage black's pawn structure. If he gets that move in, that would be excellent for him. Now, Ding, he has to find the right follow-up. Now, you can go bishop e7, but it turns out that would be a very serious mistake. For example, if you do that, then white can go knight to a3, intending knight b5, putting pressure on c7, and overall, white does have some very serious pressure. Now, beyond that, you definitely don't want to allow bishop takes f6. That would damage black's pawn structure on the king side, and despite black having the bishop pair, that would be excellent for white. Now, instead of those options here, Ding Liren, he does go knight b to d7. That is the strongest move, bolstering the knight on f6 with the other knight. Now, here, Gukesh, if he's playing ambitiously, the strongest move here is knight to h4. This really is the key move for Gukesh if he wants to play for a win. The point being, the knight on d7 does block the bishop on c8. The bishop on c8 no longer controls f5. Therefore, you go knight to h4, intending knight to f5, and that would be an excellent square for the knight. I mean, the knight on f5 pressures the bishop on d6, it pressures g7, the bishop might be forced to go back to f8, and so on, and overall, white would have something to play for. However, instead, in the game, Gukesh, he's playing very safe and solid. He just goes knight to d2, and again, this move doesn't really sit well with me. It sort of throws away all of Gukesh's advantage, and now we have sort of an equal position where black's really not in any serious trouble. Now, Ding Liren, he starts h6, a very solid move, putting pressure on the bishop. Now, where's he going to go? If you trade on f6, then black is at least equal. He would have the bishop pair, and yes, the game is temporarily closed. However, at any point in the future, if it does open up, those bishops would be monsters, and overall, I would like Ding Liren a little bit better in this position. Now, instead of that, you can also retreat back to, say, h4 or e3. In the game, Gukesh does go bishop h4, a solid move, and now Ding Liren, a very interesting move, knight to h5. He's the one actually eyeing f4 with his knight. So again, Ding Liren, so far, he is the one playing more ambitiously. I'm really shocked by that. I mean, everyone thought Ding Liren would be playing for a draw as black and Gukesh playing for a win as white, but it almost seems like it's the total opposite. Now, here, Gukesh, what are his options? He can give the king a check, rook to e1. That is a perfectly fine move. Beyond that, you could also go, say, knight f1, intending knight e3, or even a4, gaining space on the king side. In the game, he does give the king the check, rook to e1, a perfectly fine move. The king moves, king to f8. And now Gukesh, again, he's allowed the same options. For example, knight f1, a4. The computer even likes bishop d8. That's a very strange-looking move to me, but for some reason, the computer does like it. The point being, the bishop cannot go to, say, d7, and the rook cannot pressure on the bishop. as the knight on d7 does block in the bishop. Now, instead of those options here, Gukesh, he does go g4, gaining space on the king side, but this move is a little bit dubious. Now, what is the problem with this move? Well, it's very simple. It weakens the king side for almost no reason. I mean, it doesn't even stop the idea of knight f4. Now, technically, white can go bishop g3 afterwards, and the bishop is behind the pawn. That may seem optically good, but again, that g-pawn is going to be weak, and that is what happens here. So, knight f4, then bishop g3, and now white does have some pressure on the knight, but overall, again, it's kind of hard to understand what Gukesh was trying to achieve with this move g4. At least that is my personal opinion. If you disagree, let me know in the comment section below, and while you're at it, go and smash that YouTube like button. Thank you so much. All right, now, Gukesh. His main problem, of course, is the development of his queenside. He's got to get his bishop and his rook into the game. With that in mind, knight f6 and b6 do make a lot of sense in this position. Now, personally, I would have played knight f6 here. However, Ding Liren, he's got a different idea in mind. He does go knight to b6. Now, the problem I have with this, it's not really obvious to me what the knight is doing on the queen side, but again, Ding Liren, he's a better player than I am. He must have his idea here. Now, g5 for Gukesh, trying to create something on the king side, making use of that g-pawn, and of course, the pawn was being attacked by the bishop, therefore, you did have to do something about it. Now, Ding Liren takes, h takes g5, and then knight takes g5. And now, look at this. I mean, Gukesh's pawn structure on the king side is a little bit weaker. Again, I kind of don't feel great about this move g4 he played earlier. I'm kind of questioning some of his decision-making right now. Maybe he's having an off day. I don't really know. But Ding Liren overall, he may even have a slight advantage here with the better pawn structure, the very good knight on f4, the good bishop, and so on. Now, Ding Liren, bishop d7, solid move, setting up rook to e8, finally getting that a rook into the game. And now knight g to f3 for Gukesh. Now rook e8, and then instead of trading rooks, knight to e5, jumping in with the knight, a perfectly fine move. And Ding Liren, surprisingly, he does trade his bishop for that knight on e5. Bishop takes e5, and now Gukesh, he's got to find the right recapture here. It's very important. Do you take with the rook or the pawn? Well, if you like puzzles, pause the video right now and try to work out which of these recaptures is better in this position. I hope you found it. All right, here. It turns out rook takes e5 is the better recapture. You take with the rook. The point being, after rook takes, d takes, the rooks are off the board, and that will mean black, his winning chances are a little bit lower. Again, black maybe has a tiny advantage here, so rook takes e5 would be the right move. But then after that, after rook takes, d takes, then black has many different good moves that he could play, but the game does go on. Now, instead, in the game, d takes e5 was played by Gukesh, and this move turns out to be the first really serious mistake of the game for Gukesh. As you can see, the eval bar on the left really skyrocketing down. Now Ding Liren is unquestionably better, and he is technically playing for a win in this position. All right, here, Ding, he finds the strongest follow-up, knight to d3, threatening knight takes e5 in certain lines, and overall here, Ding has a lot of pressure. All right, now, what are you supposed to do with this position? Well, it turns out that threat of knight takes e5 is very serious, therefore you do need to knock off that knight on d3 immediately with the move bishop takes d3. Now, real fast, in case you're wondering, you may be saying, hey, Dr. Mike, the rook and the bishop defend the pawn, only the knight and the rook attack it. Why is knight takes e5 a real threat? Well, if you go knight takes e5 and then say bishop takes, then f6, and the bishop on e5 will be pinned to the rook on e1. There are a lot of tactics like that where tactically taking on e5 does actually work out. Now, of course, taking on d3 is not strictly required. It is the best move. You can move the rook somewhere, but if you move the rook off the e-file, then again, knight takes e5 will be the move. For example, rook b1, defending b2, then knight takes e5. That is the problem. The knight puts pressure on both the pawn on e5 and the pawn on b2. Therefore, taking on d3 really is the only good option for white. So, in the game, bishop takes d3 was played, then we have c takes d3, and now, Gukesh, the move is f3, giving his king perhaps the space on f2 to come into the game if it needs it. And now Ding Liren is going to have many different options to proceed. For example, he can bring out his bishop, say, bishop f5, defending the pawn on d3, rook e6, and rook c8 also make a lot of sense. Instead, in the game, Ding Liren does jump forward with the knight, knight to c4, jumping in, threatening knight takes d2, and of course, Gukesh, he's got to move the knight, defend the knight, or take on c4. What's it going to be? In the game, he does take on c4, knight takes c4, then d takes, and then rook to e4. jumping up with the rook, putting pressure on that weak pawn on the c4 square. Very good. However, here, Ding Liren, he finds a very simple move. He actually does not defend that pawn. Instead, bishop c6 is the move, putting pressure on the rook. And now, here, Ding Liren, he is just begging Gukesh to capture the pawn on c4. For example, rook takes c4 would be a massive blunder. Then black, all he has to do is rook d8, defending the pawn on d3, and then the threat is d2, then d1, and it turns out there is virtually no way to stop the pawn. The only way may be something like bishop e1, then after d2, you give up the bishop for the pawn, but again, then Ding Liren, he would be just winning on the spot with the extra piece. So with that in mind here, Gukesh, he does not take on c4. Instead, rook d4 is the move, a very, very important move. That move may have saved the game or stopped him from losing, however you want to look at it. Now, Ding Liren, he takes on f3. Bishop takes f3, and Ding is officially up one pawn in the endgame. Of course, this is a bishops of opposite color endgame. These endgames are notoriously drawish, especially if the rooks do come off the board. But overall, Ding Liren, a pawn is a pawn, and he is definitely in the lead here. Now, king f2 puts pressure on the bishop. Where should it go? It turns out the strongest square for the bishop is bishop h5. The point being, the bishop does defend the square d1. That way, if the pawn ever gets rolling in the future, it would be threatening d1 in one move. So, bishop h5 here, the strongest move, staying very active with the bishop. Now, instead, bishop c6 was the move, retreating the bishop, but this move turns out to be quite a bit weaker, and here Gukesh, he can just take on c4. Rook takes c4. Now, the point being, if white does go d2, then king to e2 stops the pawn, and if you go rook to d8, then rook d4, offering the rook trade, and after that rook trade, again, the king does control both d2 and d1. That means the pawn will be stopped on the spot, and therefore Gukesh here, after that one inaccurate move by Ding Liren, bishop c6 instead of bishop h5, here Gukesh has basically equalized on the spot. Now, rook d8 for Ding, then rook d4 for Gukesh, offering the rook trade. The rooks do come off the board. Rook takes, then c takes. And now we have a bishops of opposite color endgame with just the bishops. These are notoriously drawish. The game here is roughly level, and it is going to be very hard for either side to make serious progress. But let's see how it plays out. Bishop d5, putting pressure on the pawn on a2. Gukesh, of course, he does defend. b3 is the move. Then king to e7 for Ding Liren. Now, king e3, threatening king takes d3. That pawn is effectively a goner. There is no good way to defend. So king e6, then king takes d3. Now, here, Gukesh, technically he is up a pawn. However, Ding Liren, he's got a permanent blockade on the light squares. For example, he can go a6, g6, and so on, moving his bishop back and forth, and there's literally nothing white can do to make progress here. All right, g6, as promised, the light square blockade. Then king c3, then a6. Ding Liren, just as promised, going for that light square blockade. Now, king d3, king f5, king e3, king e6, and here both sides, they just go for a draw. They basically repeat moves, and we do have a threefold repetition. This is the third time this exact position was achieved. Therefore, it's a draw on the spot, and neither side can make any progress in this position. All right, what a game between Gukesh and Ding Liren. Overall, I was much more impressed by Ding Liren than Gukesh in this game. I mean, I think we're all rooting to see the true potential of Gukesh unleashed in this match, and to be honest, I'm not sure it has been yet. I mean, Ding Liren, he might be impressing me more than Gukesh so far, but we'll have to wait and see how the rest of this match turns out. I mean, there's still a lot of games, a lot of chess to go. All right, Chess YouTube, if you enjoyed this video, go and smash that like button, and check out this video right here, where I cover one of the best games that Gukesh and Ding Liren have ever played. In fact, that might be my #1 favorite game between these two players. And no, it was not from this tournament. It was one of the first games they ever played. It was 3 years ago in 2021. Gukesh was a very low-rated GM at the time, and Ding Liren was at the top of the world, rated, I believe, 2802. But despite the 200 to 300 point rating difference, Gukesh gave Ding Liren the fight of his life. That game was insane. If you haven't seen it, check it out, and I'll see you in the next video.